Welcome to this library talk today. I'm glad to see you here. It's my honor and my privilege to introduce not only a world-class scholar, but a personal friend of mine, Dr. Tommy Kidd. He's Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University, and he has consented to come and talk to us about academic life today. Tommy, welcome.
Thank you.
To Southeastern.
It's great to be here.
Now, somebody had asked you earlier if this was your first time here, but you've actually been here before, have you not?
Yeah, I have. I was here for a Baptist History Conference that you organized in 2012, right?
Yes, please don't mention that to our financial administrator around here. We made no money off of that conference, and he hasn't quite forgotten about it yet. 6 years later, I mean, it's, some people.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a pleasure to have an international cadre of scholars here for that event, and it was certainly good to have you. Now, you have some family in North Carolina, do you not?
Well, I have actually on both sides. I have my folks both grew up in Southwest Virginia, and then I consider myself to be from South Carolina. Although we grew up, I moved a lot when I was growing up, but I was born in South Carolina.
Whereabouts?
Aiken.
Oh, really?
And then went to high school in Aiken, and then went to Clemson for my undergraduate and master's.
So then, let me ask you a couple of related questions. First, how did you become interested in history, and how did a fella from down in Gamecock country wind up under the Golden Dome?
Well, yeah, Aiken is divided between Gamecocks and Tigers, but
How clumsy of me.
Well, it's part of my spiritual journey too, because I accepted the Lord at the beginning of my freshman year at Clemson. And that obviously began a spiritual journey for me, but it was also an intellectual journey that I was just learning to think as a Christian. I don't think I would have been able to articulate what was going on, but I was, hearing, because I'm at a secular university, and I'm, hearing things in my classes, and then I'm trying to sort out, well, what does my faith mean about this? And so I was, learning to think as a Christian. I started out as a poli-sci major as an undergrad. I was very interested in politics, but being a political science major sort of cured me of that. I think it was after taking a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I thought, I don't think there's anything politics that can do to help this. So I was a history minor, and I over time was gravitating more and more towards history, and decided to switch to history for my master's degree. Mm-hmm. I honestly didn't know much about kind of what I was doing, and what my folks had never really encouraged me necessarily to consider graduate school or anything like that. I mean, they're educated people, but they just didn't really know much about what that would entail. And so once I switched into studying history in the master's program there at Clemson, I started to read things about the Puritans and the Great Awakening and those sorts of things, and I was just smitten. I mean, I thought that, okay, now this is really interesting to me, and I want to know a lot more about this, and I could see myself studying this at a professional level. Somewhere in the midst of that journey, I was introduced to George Marsden's work. I don't know. I honestly don't remember if I read it just on my own or if somebody told me to read Marsden's work. But George Marsden, who became my doctoral advisor, is probably the best known, or one of the best 2 or 3 known Christian historians of kind of his generation. And I thought, this is kind of what I've been looking for, is someone writing from a Christian perspective, but who's doing academic history. I just intuitively found that really exciting, and I thought, if I could get in to work with them, that's what I want to do. So, for me, very much Notre Dame was very much first and foremost about working with George Marsden. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to get in, and it was just a fantastic environment, primarily because of Marsden, but there's lots of different people there who are interested in religion, coming from a lot of different denominational perspectives, but it was a really invigorating environment there.
Yeah, before Dr. Marsden retired, I had heard it said frequently that it was the finest evangelical history department in America.
Yeah, there's something to that. I mean, and one of the great things about Notre Dame is you do end up with a lot of different, evangelicals, different kind of, obviously Catholics, Mormon students. I mean, it's a really, and I think it attracts all those sorts of people because you know that it'll be okay for you to be a person of faith there at Notre Dame, and yet it's it's an elite setting, and so it was a great fit for me.
So when you were an undergraduate and you began to read history, that's how you got interested in becoming a professional historian. But how did you come to choose your dissertation topic? And from that, a second question: how do you choose your topics, that which you really want to explore and develop and write about? Because I know you've got all kinds of ideas, but where do they come from?
Well, I knew going into Notre Dame that I generally wanted to work on something about the Puritans, or colonial New England, something in that area. Early New England Puritanism is pretty well raked over. I mean, it's not that there's always new stuff to do on any topic. There's always new stuff to do, but the early New England Puritanism is pretty well studied, and so is the Great Awakening and the period of the Great Awakening in New England. But there was a big gap in the literature between about 1690 and the beginning of the Great Awakening in 1740-ish. And and people had talked about this. I mean, other scholars had talked about this sort of, unknown period in the history of colonial New England. So it wasn't like I realized this or something. I mean, other historians, experts on colonial New England had regularly commented on, we need to understand more about what happens between the Glorious Revolution in 1689 and the beginning of the Great Awakening. And so, it wasn't rocket science for me. I mean, I just thought, okay, well, I'll see what I can do with that period. And usually that time period was described as a time of religious decline in New England. And technically it's called the declension thesis in that area. And something about that didn't intuitively make sense to me, because it's not as if by 1740 New England had somehow become less religious. I mean, I didn't see evidence for that. But I also knew that they weren't really Puritans anymore by 1740 in any useful sense. So that brought me into just kind of the animating question was, well, what happened to the Puritans? When did they stop being Puritans, and what did they become after they were Puritans? And so that led to my dissertation topic, and then that became my first book, which was called The Protestant Interest New England After Puritanism.
Very good. Now, you mentioned Puritanism earlier today in a different context. Let me ask you this. For those of you who might not have been in that particular talk, Dr. Kidd had mentioned that one of these days, one of the projects down the pike that he might like to do is a revisiting of Puritanism. Hypothetically, if you were going to do that, walk us through the process of what it looks like to go from having an idea to drafting chapter 1.
Right. I think it looks a little different now for me than it would have when I was a graduate student. Because when you're a graduate student, there's a real premium on finding something that's not already been done.
Right.
and thus my gravitation towards this time period that's everybody knows is understudied. I don't have to worry about that as much anymore, because now, I mean, once you get established, I think there's more of an openness to revisiting as opposed to breaking entirely new ground. So if I was going to do that project, and I know now you want me to do that project, but I've already, one of the reasons I've thought about doing that is partly inspired by an old article that my doctoral advisor wrote about the Puritans, which said that the person who's the greatest historian of the American Puritans is Perry Miller, who taught at Harvard in the mid-20th century, who was very interested in the Puritans and the shape of American culture. And he did a great job with a lot of different aspects of the Puritans, but my advisor wrote an article who basically said that Miller had kind of misunderstood the Puritans in the sense that he talks about a lot of things, but not so much about them as Bible-believing Christians. And that to me suggests that there's still, an open door for the biblicist motivation of the Puritan. And obviously people have written about that, but I don't know that there's necessarily the one overview about the Puritans' biblicist ideals, and what that had to do with the founding of the New England colonies, the fate of those ideals as they confront reality in America and so forth. And so if I was going to do that, I think what I would do is, of course I already know a lot about the literature on the Puritans. It's not been the center of my expertise because my doctoral research is really 1690 and forward, where Massachusetts is founded in 1630. So I think what I would do is compile a list and a pile in my office of the sort of definitive texts on English and American Puritanism, and I would begin to conceptualize the shape of the project, because in my stage of career, books like this begin with a book proposal rather than a completed manuscript. And so I would do what I need to do to put together an outline for the book. I think I would start with the beginnings of the English Reformation and the emergence of the Puritan movement in the mid-1500s in England, do at least one background chapter, and then the crisis that leads to the emigration to the New World, and then moving forward, the first generation in the New World is maybe chapter 3, and then and shape it from there probably on down to the Glorious Revolution in the 1690s and kind of the end of Puritanism. Might take it up through the Great Awakening. I'm not sure exactly how far I would go with that. And then, I think I would begin by writing a chapter about the break with Rome in the 1530s, and I would do reading. I know the basic outline, but I don't know the details off the top of my head. But as fast as I could, I would get up to speed on the controversy that precipitated the break with Rome, and I'd start writing.
And just go with it?
I'd just go. I mean, and those of you who take my newsletter and so forth know that one of my emphases is let's get to writing as fast as we can. Now, I mean, I have a certain level of expertise in Puritanism already, but I'm not an expert on the English and early American Puritan movement. That's not what I've written on. But I'm close enough that I could get up to speed on those topics pretty quick. And I think I would be ready to write certainly within weeks of beginning that project.
Now, you mentioned your newsletter, just so that everybody will know, and we'll give you some more information about that a little bit later, but can you tell everybody how to subscribe to your newsletter, those who might not have it already?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get at it, but if you go to my Twitter profile, you would find a link to subscribe there, and you can follow me on Twitter while you're there too. But
And two for the price of one.
Yeah. So,
Excellent. Okay, so when you're writing on your Puritans or when you're writing on any other topic, can you tell us how important is contextualization for you?
well, I mean, for me as a historian, and I teach in a history department, and I do think that makes a big difference about the way. So, I think typically people approaching the Puritans from a theological perspective would tend to just want to look at the ideas, and so chronology and so forth and contextual development is not going to matter as much. I always want to know, and I'm routinely telling my graduate students this, I need to know, when are they saying this, where are they saying this, why are they saying this, the ideas that they're propounding, and it's not even necessarily purely in a context of a theological argument or something like that. I mean, you know, I was just saying to a student the other day, you know, Jonathan Edwards is saying something about, you know, this and such idea, but the student didn't mention when, and I said, well, it makes a big difference if it's the 1730s or is it the 1750s, or when is this? At what stage of his career is he saying this?
Right.
And that'll tell you a lot about why he might care about this issue right now. So I get nervous about, you know, any treatment of ideas that's sort of, you know, the idea is disembodied and just kind of floating out there, or
Right.
you know, this brain that's kind of floating out there in space somewhere, but not interacting with historical developments. So I think that probably is an emphasis that I take maybe more than, you know, a theologian would, or even somebody who's in a kind of church history context.
I see. Although I think it is important whenever you begin to look at historical theology and the outlay of that, why people say what they do and when. You know, I think context is big there too.
I do too.
So, yeah, very good. How is we were talking about your dissertation a minute ago. Let's jump back to that for just a second, because how have you developed as a scholar over time? How do you do your work now differently than, say, you might have done when you were still in graduate school?
I'm sure I go faster now than than when I was in grad school.
I envy you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I've learned writing breeds writing. That's for sure, and it does get easier over time to produce book length. I'm just used to doing that now. I'm very comfortable with my process, but some things, you know, certainly don't change. I mean, looking for a gap. I mean, there's, as if you heard my Whitefield talk at lunch. I mean, even there, I'm saying, okay, these other scholars have taken this approach, but I think we've missed this approach to Whitefield, which I also happen to think is the most important approach, and I think Whitefield would have agreed. And so I mean, you're still looking for, you know, what's the angle that I can contribute, and you're getting sufficient familiarity with the primary and secondary sources in order to get to a point where you write. I think writing, because I've written a number of books, but I blog. I've written for World Magazine for a while. I've just written in a lot of different contexts, which I think has helped me to get very, very comfortable with and have confidence about going ahead and producing prose, and it comes pretty easy for me now. But it wasn't necessarily that way when I was a graduate student.
I see. Now, something that y'all might not know, Tommy's working on an American history textbook with Lifeway. So what's the difference? Can you explain to us what the difference is in writing a textbook and writing a monograph, or let's say a biography like the Whitfield book, or like your book on the Awakenings?
It is different in the sense that there's really no primary research involved. I mean, because on any given topic, I can write a paragraph on this huge topic and then I've got to move on. So there's not really any point in me trying to break new ground on a topic I'm probably not going to be an expert in anyway. If I'm talking about the Vietnam War or something like that, I mean, why,
Okay.
why would I try to come up with something new to say? So I'm looking at big historical overviews, things out of, say, the Oxford History of the United States or something like that, that go into more depth than I can go into, but are also not, I mean, I can't read, if I'm going to write, a few paragraphs about Vietnam, I mean, it makes no sense for me to read, entire books about the Tet Offensive or something like that. I mean, I just have to give me the basic details so I can present this in a responsible, accurate way, and then I've got to move on. So compare that to writing a book on Franklin, writing a book on Whitfield, where I'm reading lots and lots of the original stuff. It's a different kind of project. It's similar in the sense that even with an American history textbook, you go into it with a sense of what's new about this, what gap does this fill, and when B&H approached me about it, and they said what we want is a textbook that will work in Christian college context, that's written from a Christian perspective, but also a professional historian, and it's not hagiography, not strong providentialist stuff about why the bullets missed George Washington's horse, and these kind of things. I mean, they want something that would be familiar to sort of a professional historical audience, and that college professors would like the idea of using this, but that's also written from in terms of values and what's important, and certainly when you get into where it becomes probably the most obvious is when you get closer to contemporary times, and we're talking about cultural wars and changes in the 1960s and so forth, where your conventional American history textbook would present these cultural changes as an unequivocal good boon for American society.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of pump the brakes a little bit and say, well,
Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, the civil rights movement, absolutely, but some of the other stuff, not so much. If you're a Christian, there's some problems here, and so they thought, and I was convinced that there's a real gap there. So that theme of finding your contribution that you can make, and it's not just saying the same old things that a lot of other people have already said.
So as part of this, walk me through this just a little bit more, because as part of your commitment to write the American history textbook, I understand that you're going to become a movie star in the works as well. Is that true?
Something like that, yeah.
Yes. Are you looking forward to being in front of the camera?
I don't mind being in front of the camera.
What will you do exactly?
We're going to do a series of mini lectures that go with each chapter, where I take a vignette.
30 of them, as I
30 of
understand.
them, but only about
Yeah.
5 minutes each, so it's not as overwhelming as it sounds. And
Still sounds overwhelming.
yeah, and tell a story that comes up in the chapter that's illustrative of some of the main themes.
That's exciting. I am looking forward to that, ultimately. You were talking a moment ago, and I've watched your career since you went to Baylor, actually. You have become increasingly outspoken about your faith. You have become increasingly outspoken about your Christian worldview from the academy, the ivory tower, if you will. What's that cost you personally?
It can be hard to know. I have occasionally, in contexts where people give anonymous reviews or feedback of my work, I've occasionally taken some flack about. There was one reader's report that I got for one of the books I did for Yale that was quite transparent about saying that this reviewer, it wasn't so much about the book, it was about me, that they didn't like me, they didn't like what I represent because I'm a Christian, which I wasn't surprised that someone would have that sentiment. I was a little surprised at how baldly, bigoted they were about being against Christians and academia. I have been in situations where people, even face to face, in a little more hostile environments, might at least imply that I'm a very narrow-minded person because I'm a Christian. And of course, I think I'm sure you're very open-minded as a secularist in comparison to me, since you're saying bigoted things right now. But I don't actually think, though, that especially in publishing, I think as long as you are willing to play by the rules of the game in terms of when I'm writing for, and actually the B&H book is the first book I've done for a Christian press. So all my publishing up to this point has been for secular presses. And as long as, like for instance, my book on the Great Awakening or the George Whitefield book, I can't, for a secular press, I can't say, oh, well, don't you see, the Holy Spirit caused this to happen, the Great Awakening. Even though I believe that, but it's not appropriate to, it's not an appropriate voice to take on, because virtually everybody I'm working for at the press are not believers, and I would tell you that. It's not like I'm saying they're nominal Christians or something. They would, if I said to them, "Are you a Christian?" they would say no, and because of the presses I'm writing for, I can assume that a certain part of my audience is going to be non-Christian. I have to write in such a way that I leave the door open to providential explanations for phenomena that are happening. In my Great Awakening book, I discuss that very directly about saying, some readers will understand this as something that God is doing. Others won't see it that way, and I'm not going to drag you along and make you, because that would be off-putting to non-Christian readers. And I think if my books have an evangelistic function, which I think they do, then I've got to be attentive to the non-Christian reading this, and I would want them to come away feeling like, I don't know if I do have a good explanation for why this happened. But if I start saying, no, you've got to accept God did this, they'll say that, I can't
shut you down.
I can't roll with you on this. And there have been people, it doesn't happen that often, but there are major historians, like Eugene Genovese, for instance, who worked on slave religion in the antebellum period, who became a Christian. He's an Emory University historian, or I'm sorry, a UGA historian. His wife was at Emory, who went from being an atheist communist, right, to becoming a Christian because
so did Betsy.
Right. So they see the substance of these people's faith and they say, I have no way to explain this other than the power of what I see in their faith. But if I said to that atheist communist from the get-go, you have to assume with me that God did this, that doesn't work. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but with publishers, I've had a great relationship with Yale, with Oxford, Princeton. I mean, and I have never, ever, ever felt like anybody there was saying, "Hey, you gotta pull this back a little bit with your Christian perspective." Never a peep about that. And I think part of it is they realize that there is a vital Christian market. People like Marsden and Mark Knoll have paved the way. The publishers are used to people having Christian perspectives now, and they're just not put off by this. They would be if I was insistently providential.
Right.
Because they would just say, "This, don't you understand? I mean, this isn't completely our audience. We know that you'll have some Christian readers, but not all of them. I mean, but I've never had to have that discussion with them."
Well, now you said something really interesting a minute ago. You said that you would hope that your books have an evangelistic element or an evangelistic thrust. How do you incorporate, work's not the right word, how do you incorporate the gospel into the text of the story, or the way that you're weaving that story? How do you do that and not be offensive?
I think actually the Franklin book may be one of the most overt places that I did it, because I'm trying there to get into the mind of this very enigmatic person who
True.
insisted he was a certain kind of a Christian, but is having a long-term sort of debate with people like George Whitefield and his sister about the nature of true faith. And I think anybody reading it will realize that on one hand, I try to take Franklin's beliefs totally seriously. I think he's a very serious person intellectually, and he has good reasons for believing all the things that he does. And I don't, at the end of the day, think he was a Christian.
Right.
And I think his ideas at a fundamental level don't work. And I think that anybody reading it will infer that, and anybody who knows who I am will know that I'm watching him, wrestle with these things and seeing how what he's trying to do about faith and spirituality is so utterly typical of what Americans do today.
He was spiritual.
He was spiritual,
Yeah.
but couldn't bring himself to confess, that Jesus was Lord. And so I'm trying to sort of sympathetically interact with that, but I think anybody reading the book will come away seeing that I think that Whitefield and Franklin's sister Jane Mecom are right about this, even though, again, for my audience, I do not insist that they come to that conclusion with me. But they'll see me being troubled about Franklin's faith. And I've had people who've talked to me about it, and I didn't quite see it this way, but I've had people react to the book already saying, I see what you were doing. You were sharing the gospel with people, which I didn't see. I didn't mean for it to be overt like that, and I think it is still indirect. But I was pleased with that reaction, because that is part of what I had in mind.
Very good. Now, not long ago, if I'm not mistaken, on your newsletter, you had said something about prayer as part of your writing process and so forth. So when you do your background reading, when you begin to put words on the page, or even in the editorial process, where does that prayer come in?
It's just part of my daily routines. It's not that I have any kind of special. I mean, I wish I had some kind of, when you get to dissertation proposal stage, have this, prayer retreat. So I mean, you can do that if you want to, but wouldn't be a bad idea. But I I had a blogger approach me, and he just simply asked, "What role does prayer play in your work?" And I had never really thought about it before in any kind of system. I just kind of thought, that's an interesting question. I guess I do pray about my writing. And
Do you pray anything specifically about your writing or about a given project that you're working on at any time?
Most commonly, this is in the context of in the morning, I'm reading the scripture. I go through 1 year, Bible reading plan. So the first thing I do when I get up in the morning is I read scripture and then I pray. And I have different topics that I pray about every weekday morning. One day is especially focused on my church and those sorts of things. But usually one of the main things that I'm praying about is I pray, and this isn't some epic thing. It's not like I'm praying from 5 to 7 a.m. or something. This is just part of my daily routine. And I pray through everything I'm going to do that day, the major signposts on the calendar, if I'm having a meeting or meeting with a student or a colleague or something, my pastor or something like that, I'll pray about that. But then I just think about what in general am I going to be working on today. And on writing days, I'm praying about my writing, and I pray different things, but I pray that I'll honor God in the way I work. I almost every time pray that I won't waste time, and that God will be glorified in my writing. Those are probably the most common prayers that I pray, is that I won't waste time and that God will be glorified in my writing.
Outstanding. So it is possible to be an academician, it is possible to be a serious scholar, and to be a man of prayer. We talked about this some time back, but you're still an elder in your church, are you?
I'm not anymore, no.
Not anymore.
I served a term, and I had little children at home, and in that season of the church, we were going through a lot of transitions and so forth, and I thought, my kids see me frustrated about church a lot, and so I thought they're little. So it was my term. I'd served for 3 years, and
Right.
my term was up, and I thought this is a good time for me to have a peaceful stepping down as elder. It also we had mostly had elders who kind of were for life, which I didn't necessarily think was the best precedent, and so.
Right.
So I thought this can actually be of help to me and to the church, and I'm easily replaceable, and I was easily replaced with somebody better than me to go on the board, and so.
So did you leave before or after the pastor search?
Before. We had a long-term, wonderfully successful pastor who was getting near retirement, and that was going to get difficult for all the usual reasons.
Gotcha. Now, you said something just now. You said your children had seen you frustrated and things like this. Tell us about academic life, the academy, being a good husband, being a good father, and how you shield your family from institutional frustrations.
I'm not always successful, both with my institution and with the church. I try to, one of the reasons I am focused on not wasting time is so that I can be freed up to not be constantly dabbling in work when I'm off of work. It was different when we didn't have kids. I can remember, and I was on tenure track, and so I love it, but it was good kind of pressure, but I had to publish or I was not going to get tenure. And so I can remember those days, that summer before my first child was born, certainly going in on Saturdays you know, and working long hours and all those sorts of things, and then he was born, and that contracted some, you know. I'm a
Life
little,
changed.
Yeah, life
Yeah.
changed a lot, and it's a bigger change, I think, than even getting married.
Oh, yeah.
And so now that I have tenure, you know, it's not like I've pulled way back on publishing, but I'm not under as much pressure anymore, for sure. And so I build in, I mean, I'm definitely a practical Sabbatarian, just because I think, you know, I don't, I'm kind of open about, you know, people can do what their conscience dictates about the Sabbath, but I sure know it's good to have, and I think the Lord has wired us up to have a day off that's completely off from your work. I know pastors have to handle that differently, but for me, I don't ever do Baylor work at all on Sundays. Never. And I just
Okay.
don't. I check email once or twice on Sunday, but that's the extent of it. I also build in email. I think is one of the most intrusive, you know, factors in
Yes.
your work life, and so I do not check email except under unusual situations. I don't check email after 5 p.m. on weekdays, and I don't check much at all on the weekends. But 5 p.m. is a pretty hard and fast rule for me, and I don't check again until I get to work the next morning, and so that builds in for me about 15 hours a day that I'm not on email, 15 hours straight. And now, I mean, if I was the president of Baylor University or something, that it might be harder for me to keep that going. But it also establishes an expectation for people I work with of, if you send me an email at 6, don't expect to get a response. And it's not you. I'm not ignoring you. I don't respond at night.
Gotcha.
I just don't. And that does a couple things. I mean, it helps protect my time. Now, I mean, believe me, I'm on Twitter in the evening, but there's something about email. I mean, because that's where the emergencies come in, and student angry about this and that, and you know, problems come up, and I don't want to see that at 9 p.m.
Right.
I don't want to see that before I go to bed, and it's just a way for me to protect home time and let home be home and let work be work, and that works fine as long as I'm being really efficient at work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're just dabbling around all the time at work, at home, I don't think you get as much done, even if you are working on Saturdays and Sundays.
Exactly.